Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
The seal had remained untouched for years, hidden behind layers of royal discretion and one dead prince's final instruction. Then William opened it. What he found was not a sentimental note, nor a private family confession, but a direct restriction written in Philip's name, one that placed Diana's most personal jewelry beyond Camilla's reach. In a single moment, an old wound inside the monarchy became a living order, with consequences no one could quietly bury. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William stood over the document at Windsor in a silence that made everyone careful. The envelope had been preserved among Prince Philip's restricted private papers, records withheld because they contained instructions for specific family circumstances. Beside it sat the inventory for Diana's private jewelry room, a protected collection separate from the crown jewels, the ceremonial gems owned by the monarchy and used for state occasions. This room held something far more intimate: gifts, inherited pieces, ownership notes, handwritten records, and objects tied directly to Diana's life and to the sons who had survived her. The prince broke the seal and read slowly. Then he stopped. Philip's decree was explicit. Camilla was to have no access to Diana's private jewelry room, and she could not authorize the removal, reassignment, wearing, or reclassification of anything inside it. William read the paragraph again, lowered the paper, and said nothing. An archivist waited across from him, watching shock harden into concentration. This was no vague family preference. It was a written boundary, preserved for the exact moment someone might try to cross it. Camilla learned soon afterward that the document had been opened, and the news struck deeper than the restriction itself. The queen consort could accept being denied a room. What wounded her was the implication behind it. Philip had expected a future dispute strongly enough to leave a safeguard behind. As she absorbed that knowledge, William discovered something worse. A sealed attachment listed specific pieces that his grandfather believed must never be absorbed into wider royal collections. Through administrative convenience, William turned the final page and found one handwritten notation beside Diana's name. It referred to an earlier confrontation, but gave no full account of what had happened. His thumb rested over Philip's signature before he finally looked at the archivist and asked, "Who knew this existed?" The answer came quietly: very few people, and one of them was still inside the palace. Because the decree did more than close a door to Camilla, it forced William to confront why Philip believed that door would someday need protecting at all. Behind the legal wording sat three people bound by the same royal history, but wounded by it in completely different ways. For William, the room represented his mother. For Camilla, it represented a past she could never escape. And for Charles, it threatened to reopen the most painful division of his adult life. Philip's decree had survived because the emotions behind it had never truly disappeared, and now every one of them was being forced into the open. William returned to the inventory with none of the satisfaction others might have expected. The prince was not looking at diamonds, sapphires, or financial value. He was looking at fragments of Diana's life. Some entries described gifts she had worn during deeply personal years. Others noted inherited pieces, and several were linked to occasions he remembered from childhood. The private collection was more than jewelry. It functioned as a surviving family archive, meaning a group of personal objects and records preserved because of who owned them and what they represented. For William, that made the decree feel less like authority and more like responsibility. Camilla received confirmation in a private sitting room later that day. She asked her aide only one question: did Philip's instruction name her directly? When the answer came back yes, she turned away and remained silent. The queen held one of the highest positions in royal life, Yet this restriction placed a clear boundary around one part of Diana's legacy she could never enter. That exclusion carried weight, because rank normally brought access. Here, it did not. Philip had deliberately separated status from ownership, and Camilla understood exactly what that implied. Charles felt the pressure almost immediately. The king wanted to protect his wife from humiliation, but he also knew what challenging the document could mean. Philip had been his father. Diana had been the mother of his sons. If he tried to overturn the restriction, it could appear that he was erasing one man's final instruction while weakening another woman's protected legacy. That was a battle Charles did not want, yet Camilla's silence made doing nothing feel almost as painful. William kept reading. Philip's sealed attachment carefully separated pieces Diana personally owned from jewels that had only been loaned through royal channels. A royal loan meant an item remained part of another collection, even if someone wore it temporarily. And that distinction suggested Philip had examined the ownership issue in detail before signing anything. This was not a hurried warning. It had been built to survive challenge. Charles finally entered and asked to see the decree himself. William slid the pages across the table, but kept one hand resting on the attachment. Father and son held each other's gaze before the monarch looked down and began reading. Then William noticed the line Philip had underlined more heavily than any other, the incident following the anniversary reception. And buried beneath those careful words was the memory of one night when a single request involving Diana's jewelry changed everything. Years before William broke the seal, the royal family had already come dangerously close to this confrontation. The trigger was not a grand constitutional crisis. It was one private request made after a formal anniversary reception, quiet enough to escape public notice, but serious enough for Philip to remember every detail. By the following morning, the Duke had begun asking questions about ownership, access, and authority. Within days, he had decided that one part of Diana's legacy needed a permanent wall around it. Camilla had been told that several pieces linked to Diana were being catalogued separately after the Windsor anniversary reception. Some were personal gifts. Others were jewels tied to her sons, rather than to the sovereign. The palace inventory was simply the official record showing what existed, who owned it, and who had authority over it, while conservation meant the careful preservation of fragile or valuable pieces. That distinction mattered, because these were not ordinary royal ornaments. They carried family ownership, private memory, and the emotional weight of a woman whose absence still shaped the people around her. Camilla made the request quietly. She asked a senior collection custodian whether one sapphire piece associated with Diana could be transferred temporarily for use at a forthcoming diplomatic dinner. The custodian hesitated. He explained that the jewel had been recorded as private property and that permission would have to come through Diana's sons. She stiffened at the answer and replied that she was asking about access, not ownership. The difference sounded small, but inside the palace, it changed everything. Philip heard about the exchange through the custodian's documented account the next morning. He immediately requested the full inventory and asked to meet Camilla privately. The Duke did not accuse her of theft or deception. He did something colder. He warned that personal family property could never be allowed to blur into institutional privilege simply because someone held a senior royal position. Camilla felt humiliated by the implication, while he believed the matter had already moved beyond one necklace. To Philip, the danger was symbolic. Diana's possessions could not become trophies inside a rewritten version of royal history. Philip closed the folder and pushed it back toward the custodian. He then gave the instruction that would echo years later. Diana's private jewelry room was to remain locked unless her sons approved access. Camilla left before he had finished speaking. That moment became the point of no return. Within days, Philip dictated the hidden decree, named Camilla directly, and ordered the document sealed so no future palace pressure could soften it after his death. The custodian who witnessed the original dispute never forgot the wording, and now William had learned that the man was still available. The prince wanted him brought to Windsor immediately. Years later, William was about to repeat almost the same instruction Philip had given. But this time, he would have to say it directly to the Queen. There was no press office, no advisor to soften the language, and no ceremonial smile to hide behind. William and Camilla sat across from each other, with Philip's decree between them. She knew what it said. He knew what it meant. Neither could pretend this was only about jewelry. Every old resentment surrounding Diana, every argument about memory and legitimacy, had been compressed into a few paragraphs, and now one of them had to say the words aloud. William had requested the Windsor meeting himself, and kept the room almost empty. No aides were allowed to interpret the mood, and no private secretary could soften what followed. The decree, a formal written instruction intended to control access and authority, rested between them as the prince told Camilla that Philip's restriction would be enforced exactly as written. No direct entry, no delegated permission, no removal, wearing, reassignment, or reclassification of Diana's private pieces without the approval required under the order. Camilla held her anger in check at first. Then she asked the question William knew was coming. Did he truly believe she intended to take something that belonged to his mother? The prince answered carefully. He said the point of Philip's decree was not to accuse her after the fact, but to ensure the question could never arise again. When Diana's name passed between them, his hand tightened against the edge of the table. He paused, regained control, and continued. Camilla finally let the deeper wound surface. She told him that she had spent decades being judged through the memory of a woman who was no longer alive, and now even a locked room had become another measure of her place in the family. William listened, but he did not retreat. For him, this was not about ranking one woman above another. His mother's possessions carried ownership records, family instructions, and memories that belonged to her sons. Allowing uncertainty now could create a fight that would reach the next generation. William then revealed the discovery that changed the conversation. He had ordered the access registry checked, the official record showing who had requested entry and under whose authority. One entry from the previous year showed a request submitted through an office connected to Camilla's household. No jewelry had been released, but the request existed. Camilla's anger turned instantly to shock. She insisted she had never authorized it. The Queen pushed the decree back across the table and demanded that William distinguish between her decisions and those made by someone using her office. He did not accuse her, but he also refused to dismiss the warning. William left the copy where it was. "It stays here," he said. Camilla rose and walked out, the door closing hard behind her. But anger could not settle the dispute, because William had already decided the next question was colder than memory. Who legally controlled Diana's room, and could even Charles override Philip's terms? Royal rank can open almost every door, but not every possession inside the monarchy belongs to the crown. That distinction suddenly became decisive. Philip had designed his decree around ownership, trusteeship, and family consent, making it far harder to dismiss as an old husband's private opinion. William now had to establish whether the document carried real force. Charles had to decide how far he would defend Camilla, and one longtime custodian knew the answer before either man finished asking the question. William pushed for a full legal review before anyone made another move. Diana's jewelry holdings had never existed as one simple collection. Some pieces were her personal property, others were family-held items, while historic loans remained attached to separate royal collections. A trustee was someone formally responsible for protecting property on behalf of others, and Philip had built his order around that distinction. He had not tried to control everything connected to the monarchy. He had focused only on the pieces, records, and private spaces that could be governed through family ownership and documented consent. Charles read the summary in silence. The king removed his glasses, set them beside the papers, and stared at the paragraph confirming that a royal command alone would not erase the arrangement. To overturn Philip's restriction, he would have to challenge the ownership structure beneath it. That mattered, because doing so could drag Diana's sons, family trustees, and inherited property rights into the dispute. What had begun as a locked door could become a much wider family battle. William felt relief, but it came with pressure. The prince now knew his father could not simply wave the restriction away, yet that also meant he had inherited responsibility for enforcing it. Then the longtime keeper of the private collection produced the document that changed the balance completely. A duplicate instruction signed by Philip and countersigned by a family trustee. The second signature meant another responsible party had formally recognized the terms. This was no longer easy to dismiss, as personal anger preserved on paper. William kept reading, and found something even more important. Philip had added a succession clause, an instruction explaining who inherited responsibility when the original guardians were gone. Diana's designated private pieces were to remain under the protection of her sons, and then pass according to recorded ownership to their descendants. Suddenly, Catherine and the children were no longer distant names in the future. George, Charlotte, and Louis were part of the reason this decision mattered now. Charles finally set the legal summary down. He looked at his son and spoke without force. He would not destroy his father's order. William heard the words, but the exhaustion on the monarch's face revealed the cost. Protecting Philip's instruction meant accepting a limit that would hurt Camilla personally. By the next morning, that pain became real. The decree was no longer a hidden document. It had become a rule, and the first visible consequence was about to fall directly on Camilla's household. The first consequence was brutally simple. Access codes were changed. Names were removed. Old permissions disappeared from the registry. No speech announced it. No ceremony marked it. Yet inside the palace, everyone understood what had happened. Philip's dead hand had reached into the present, and Camilla was now facing a boundary that her title could not erase. What wounded her most was not being stopped. It was knowing William had chosen to enforce the order himself. William gave the instruction without drama. The prince told the collection custodian to update the restricted access list and remove every standing permission that was not supported by Diana's ownership records. A restricted access list was simply the formal record of who could enter a protected collection and under what authority. But this change carried far more than administrative weight. Even staff working for Camilla would now need written approval through William or Harry before requesting conservation work, inventory checks, or exhibition use involving Diana's designated private pieces. The old habit of assuming access through rank was over. Camilla received the news from her private secretary. A planned review of the collection had been cancelled, and the Queen immediately asked whether William had signed the restriction personally. When she was told yes, her expression changed. She had expected Philip's document to hurt. She had not expected the future king to become the one enforcing it. That distinction mattered, because William was not an archivist following instructions. He was Diana's son, and every signature now felt like a judgment delivered across decades. Charles tried to comfort her privately, but Camilla finally said what had been building inside her. She told the king that one mention of Diana could still make years of duty, loyalty, and public service feel as though they vanished. He reminded her that the order protected property, not her worth. Yet he also knew those words could not remove the humiliation of being named in a restriction written long before this day. William then received the result of the access inquiry. The suspicious request from the previous year had come from a junior household office using an outdated authorization code. Camilla had not personally approved it. That finding cleared her of the most immediate suspicion, but it exposed exactly the kind of careless assumption Philip had feared. William refused to weaken the restriction anyway. He explained to Catherine that certainty was the entire point. No ambiguity, no inherited permissions, no quiet exceptions. She understood the burden beneath his decision. He was protecting his mother while confronting his father's wife, and neither role allowed him an easy escape. Camilla later reached the collection corridor after being told her authorization was gone. She never tried the door. She stood there for several seconds, then simply turned away. But the retreat was not surrender. Instead of challenging William through Charles or palace advisors, she requested one private conversation with him alone. And when that request reached William, he realized she was no longer preparing to fight Philip's decree. For once, there was no monarch between them, and no dead relative speaking through a document. William and Camilla met privately as two people trapped inside the same painful family history. She came without advisors. He brought no paperwork. The decree had already won its legal battle. What remained was far harder, deciding whether the restriction would become another permanent wound or whether both of them could accept what Philip had been trying to protect, without pretending the past had never happened. Camilla spoke first. She told William she would not contest Philip's decree, and she would not ask Charles to overturn it. The Queen acknowledged something she had resisted saying aloud. Diana's personal possessions belonged emotionally and legally with her sons. That mattered, because the argument had never really been about royal rank. It was about whether private ownership and family memory could survive the pressures of palace life. William had expected resistance. Instead, the prince heard a concession he had not prepared for. Camilla then admitted why the wording had cut so deeply. Philip's restriction did more than close a door. It confirmed that he had once doubted her judgment strongly enough to leave protection behind after his death. She told William that she could accept the boundary, but she could not pretend the insult carried no weight. He listened without defending his grandfather. The future king answered that her acceptance of the restriction mattered more to him than Philip's private opinion of her. The practical protection of Diana's legacy, he said, had to be separated from old personal wounds. Camilla went further. In that private conversation, she acknowledged the original sapphire request from years earlier. She insisted she had never intended to claim ownership of Diana's piece. She had wanted it considered for official use at a diplomatic event, and had misjudged how deeply that request would be felt by the family. William did not excuse the mistake, but he understood the distinction. The admission changed the tone between them, because, for the first time, neither was arguing through someone else's memory. William then made his own concession. The later access request had come from a junior household office, using outdated authority, and he accepted that Camilla had not personally approved it. Her name would not be blamed for an action she did not authorize. The decree would remain in force, but he would stop treating its existence as proof of present-day wrongdoing. Camilla stood to leave. Before she reached the door, she told William she would never ask to enter Diana's room again. He gave a small nod. Then this ends between us here. Inside Windsor, the argument had finally cooled. But once their agreement was formally recorded, details of Philip's decree began slipping beyond palace walls, and the private settlement was about to become a public storm. By morning, a private family restriction had become a national symbol. The public was no longer debating a locked jewelry room. They were debating Diana, Philip, Camilla, William, and who had the right to protect memory inside a monarchy built on inheritance. The story spread because everyone understood the symbolism instantly. A dead prince had drawn a line, a future king had enforced it, and the Queen had agreed not to cross it. Britain reacted with extraordinary intensity. William saw the coverage before breakfast, and immediately understood how far the story had escaped palace control. A leak had exposed the central terms of Philip's decree, including the restriction on Camilla and the prince's decision to enforce it. Inside the palace, officials argued over whether acknowledging the document would deepen the controversy, or whether silence would make the family appear evasive. A custodial instruction, the formal rule governing who may control or access privately held property, had suddenly become a national argument about memory, rank, and ownership. William read one headline twice and looked away. He had viewed the decision as protection for Diana's personal legacy, not as a public judgment on Camilla. That difference mattered because the prince knew how easily duty could become spectacle once the story left Windsor. Catherine watched him fold the newspaper in half until Diana's photograph disappeared from view. He then told her he wanted the room fully documented for George, Charlotte, and Louis. He did not want their grandmother's possessions preserved forever as ammunition in another family conflict. Camilla faced the storm differently. She remained composed during her public duties, but later told Charles in a private recorded conversation preserved by a palace secretary that she feared decades of service would be reduced to one humiliating headline. The king understood the danger immediately. Philip's order protected Diana's property, yet the public could easily turn that boundary into a verdict on every painful chapter that had come before. Outside Kensington Palace, the emotion became impossible to ignore. A crowd gathered near the gates, while a major morning paper carried 3 words across its front page: Philip's final line. Diana, William, and Camilla appeared beneath the headline, turning a private decree into a symbol anyone could understand. One broadcaster framed the dispute not as a jewelry scandal, but as a question of whether private family memory should remain protected even from royal rank. That distinction shifted the mood toward William's responsibility rather than revenge. The palace finally responded with a brief confirmation, stating that privately owned family possessions remained governed by existing custodial instructions, and that all parties had accepted the arrangement. Camilla did not challenge it. William did not celebrate it. Instead, he prepared one final decision concerning Diana's room. The decree had begun as a prohibition, but William was about to transform it into something Philip may have intended all along: protection with a purpose. The final decision did not come with anger. It came with a key, an inventory, and William standing inside the legacy he had spent days defending. Philip's decree had stopped Camilla from entering Diana's private jewelry room, but William now understood that exclusion was never meant to be the story's final purpose. The real question was what would become of the things behind that door. His answer ended the confrontation, protected his mother's memory, and changed the meaning of the decree forever. William ordered a complete preservation review of Diana's private jewelry. The prince wanted every item separated clearly: pieces intended for family inheritance, objects requiring conservation, and records that needed permanent documentation. Conservation meant the careful protection of valuable or fragile items so they could survive for future generations. And that mattered, because this collection was no longer only about the past. George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day inherit the responsibility attached to it. William wanted no confusion waiting for them. Camilla accepted the final restriction without another challenge. She would receive no personal access, ownership rights, or authority over Diana's designated private collection. The Queen did not protest. Instead, she told Charles in a private conversation that she no longer wanted the room discussed as a contest between herself and Diana. Some legacies, she said, were simply not hers to inherit. The king understood what that admission cost her, but he also knew it finally removed the bitterness that had kept the dispute alive. Charles then approved the arrangement quietly. He recognized that honoring Philip's written boundary protected more than jewelry. It prevented William and Harry from ever feeling that their mother's private possessions could be absorbed into another chapter of royal life. The monarch had spent days caught between his father's instruction and his wife's pain. Now he could accept both without destroying either. William made one final generational decision. Detailed records of Diana's personal pieces would be preserved for George, Charlotte, and Louis, with ownership instructions written so clearly that no future royal rank could blur them. The future king was no longer simply defending his mother from the past. He was protecting his children from inheriting the same argument. William finished the inventory, closed Diana's jewelry register, and returned the key to its protected case. Then he signed an instruction of his own. The collection would pass according to Diana's recorded wishes and Philip's safeguards, with no discretionary exception. That signature ended the conflict. Camilla did not fight again. Charles accepted the settlement. William refused to turn Philip's decree into a weapon. The final meaning was clear. Philip had not decided who won between Diana and Camilla. He had established that royal status could not rewrite personal ownership, emotional inheritance, or family memory. William gave that principle permanence. The door finally closed on a settled decision. Philip's warning had been honored. Camilla had accepted its limit, and Diana's private legacy was protected for the generations it was always meant to reach. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.